Just going back to what I was asking you earlier, and a lot of those you were deferring to the emergency works and the summer work scheme. Can you just maybe confirm, are there caps on the amounts available to each school on both of those schemes? And I just want to ask you, in terms of the decision-making process, particularly for rural schools, how much weight is the population given? And you talked about data and projections going forward. Maybe just to talk a little bit more in terms of the data available to you and how you work that out, how many years you go back, how you assess, I suppose, within a community in terms of birth rates and all that, in terms of what the demand that will be needed there, and also just in terms of your provision for ventilation and air purification systems. And finally, just your interface with the Department of Transport and yourselves in terms of where decisions are made around schools, again, even in terms of Gale Skulls, how that's all joined up in terms of the decision-making process around which schools to invest in. Thanks. It's a bit there.
Thank you, Deputy. I suppose your questions span a couple of areas. I'll ask John to come in on the ventilation and the air filters piece. In terms of emergency works and summer works, there isn't a particular cap or limit on the project cost. Like the issue really, like if it's an emergency issue, it's an emergency issue. The real issue and the real question is it an emergency issue to be dealt with under the emergency work scheme, or is it something to be done on a more planned basis as part of the multi-annual summer work scheme? You know that, but there isn't a particular cap. No more than the summer works. If a roof had to be replaced as part of summer works, the cost of the roof is whatever is the tendered cost of the roof. It isn't a particular limit put on that, or be it windows, etc., etc. You know, so like that's the way that gets managed. In terms of data projections, and I suppose you're looking at that from the perspective of more the small rural school, you know, versus, you know, where our bigger demographic pressures are. And like, as I said earlier, for the last 20 years or so, the Plan and Building Unit's focus has been very much on additional capacity, you know, which, you know, in terms of adding capacity, catering for need, particularly the bulge at primary level initially, then into post-primary, catering for special needs and working that through. The smaller primary schools, and I went to a small primary school myself in the west of Ireland, they weren't in the same pressure point in terms of capacity. The issues there are more about modernisation and facilities generally, as distinct from capacity requirements. And I suppose the direction of travel generally about demographics, and which can impact on those schools as well. The direction of travel at primary level is that a projected reduction of the order of 100,000 pupils over the next decade or so. And I suppose the west of Ireland and the rural areas there, and maybe the North Mayo piece of that as well, would probably be areas that might be potentially more impacted there than other areas, and declining birth rates generally. I don't know, Anya, whether you want to add anything further.
Just in terms of our projections to the medium long term, obviously we've child benefit data which tells us where the babies and the toddlers are, but beyond that we use information from the ESRI who've done work in terms of population under the linked to the Project Ireland 2040 population targets, and they've that broken down by local authority area and by age. So they have a projection for County Mayo that in 2029 there will be X number of 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Obviously, distilling that down to local areas is transacted through, we work it through with the local authorities in terms of their county development plans. It's difficult to pin down exactly, but it does give us a reasonable estimation of trends generally.
You can see the difficulty in terms of things being population driven. That then, you know, how do you entice people to get into an area? And then if you have areas without schools, you know, you're almost given up, if you like. If you're just following the population, if you're not doing things to attract the population in there, to increase the population. But I know there are a couple of other questions.
I wouldn't like to think that there'd be a feeling that we're ignoring the small rural schools. They're very valuable. They're very fabric of a community. And, you know, we support them through the schemes I referenced earlier. And we see an important part of that as well in terms of the direction of travel generally, in terms of the modernisation and climate agenda going forward. But that obviously by its nature has a longer time frame involved as well. But, you know, small rural schools have an important role to play in terms of fabric of villages and communities generally as well. I might ask John Dolan, who's our technical manager on climate generally, but to focus particularly on the ventilation side of things and HEPA air filters, if that was part of the question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. So managing ventilation is just one of a suite of public health measures in place to keep schools safe.
Can I just ask you a specific question? That how many of the schools, in terms of national schools and secondary schools, now have those filters in place?
Yeah, so I suppose the funding arrangements were put in place under the Emergency Works for Schools to apply for additional funding to assist with ventilation. And to date, 35 schools have applied for additional funding. Of these, 24 were approved. 2 were incorrectly classified as ventilation-related issues and are being assessed separately. 7 were returned as the application was not fully completed, and 2 are awaiting for the schools to revert with further information.
35 out of how many?
There's approximately 3,300 primary schools in the country. So, but none of these applications were for the funding of HEPA filters. So the funding for HEPA filters went out as part of the COVID funding arrangements, where the schools, again, being best suitable to judge where they needed air cleaners or not, were able to utilise their own funding that was provided through the department for the purchase of air filters.
Yeah, so do we know how many, in terms of the different funding streams that were available to schools, do we know right at this moment in time how many have, how many actually have them in place? What I'm thinking of, if we were to have a COVID outbreak again or development, say next winter, how many schools would be in a better situation than they were during COVID, you know, in terms of keeping the windows open, the doors open, all of those things?
So I suppose where the funding was devolved to the schools made the decision themselves if they needed to purchase an air cleaner or not.
Yeah, and I understand that, but have we measured it as a department? Have we measured it in terms of where things are at? Do you know what I'm trying to get at?
Maybe you might be able to have the conversation when we're finished the meeting. You might be able to.
Okay, I think it's a very important question, because if we don't measure things as we're going along, then we don't know what to do in order to plan, and we need to plan for future pandemics and what might happen there. And I think it's a very basic health and safety issue within schools. I think that we need to work collectively to make sure.
And I would say, Deputy, the provision for measurement was allocated to schools through the CO2 monitors, which allowed the schools to establish the level of CO2 in the room, which is related to airborne contaminants. So there is the provision in all schools. These were centrally distributed from the Department of Education. Every school got a number within the country, and I think the last count was over 40,000 of them issued, and we can confirm that figure.
No, that's really good.
So there was that scope for measurement provided to the school community.
Yeah. But then in order to be able to, so we need to match up the two, obviously, to make sure that we're not just looking at those things, that we have the solutions in place as well. I just think while we have time to use them.
Absolutely, yeah. And what, I suppose what it allowed happen was it allowed the schools to determine if they had a subventilation issue in their school, and 35 of them obviously determined they did and made applications for additional funding of the emergency works. So that has proven successful to allow the schools to measure if they needed that and to apply for the funding that was put in place for it.
I'm surprised it's so low, and I think we need to look at why it's so low. I mean, were there, you know, is it too bureaucratic, or were there things there? I think it may be something that maybe is worth another look at in why that is so low.
And maybe, Deputy, just as a general point, I think the figure on the CO2 monitors was 42,000 or thereabouts. I suppose what we provided to the school system as part of supporting COVID and keeping schools operational, we provided top-up minor works grant funding to schools, and that gave schools to discretion. And it wasn't just about HEPA air filters. The issue really was about working through solutions locally of what works best for them in terms of helping them to support and operate them in the COVID environment. And that can be as simple and as straightforward, for example, as making sure that the vents are working in the classroom. There may be trickle vents to be installed and provided in the windows and all of that as well. And ultimately, it's important to note as well, and John is our technical manager in this area, HEPA filters have a role, but ultimately fresh air and diluting the air quality in the room is really the way forward. And whether you have a HEPA air filter or not, the real issue is about making sure there's fresh air coming into the school.
Absolutely, and if you went to a school in the west of Ireland, you know opening the windows is not...
I was going to say, then I have the parents giving out to us about the school is called...